I had some issues with the technology that we use to live stream. So if you look at the live stream later, if you look at it now, it looks different. Hopefully we'll get maybe an idea of what we're going to do next. Basically, the technology that we were using, the company went out of business a long time ago, and because a tech company goes out of business, they don't update their software. And basically, eventually, if you don't update the software for technology, eventually that technology becomes obsolete. So we'll figure out what we're going to do as a replacement for that. If you would be making your way in your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 20, we left off last week around verse 14. Of course, at this point, talking about the life of Hezekiah, that is also described to us in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. So we know that Hezekiah is remembered as a good king in Israel's history, or Judah's history at this point, since we've got the divided kingdom. We know that Hezekiah did a lot of good things. He instituted a lot of reforms that no other king, essentially since David, had put in place. And that made him great in the eyes of the Lord, at least how he is described earlier in the book of 2 Kings. We know that Hezekiah had moments in life where he was challenged, obviously told, as we saw last week, that he was about to die, faced with the knowledge of that. We know that he had to deal with the invasion of the Assyrians and the city of Jerusalem being besieged. And that was a whole ordeal that he had to deal with. But what we're looking at in verses 12 through 19, at the moment that they occurred, did not seem to be that great of a test or that great of a problem for Hezekiah to deal with. Of course, this is all in the context of Hezekiah being sick, and apparently verses 12 through 19 perhaps also occurred before the events of chapter 19, the siege of Jerusalem. But if we look at 2 Chronicles chapter 32, that chapter records that God sent the Babylonians to test Hezekiah. Specifically in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 31, the Bible records, however, regarding the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon whom they sent to him to inquire about the wonder that was done in the land, God withdrew from him in order to test him, that he might know all that was in his heart. And that verse is important for us to understand, because if we backed up a few verses earlier, chapter 32, verse 25 of 2 Chronicles, it said that Hezekiah did not repay according to the favor shown him, for his heart was lifted up, therefore wrath was looming over him and over Judah and Jerusalem. So evidently, God's act of grace in terms of adding years onto the life of Hezekiah led to Hezekiah developing a sense of pride within his heart. And that's important to understand for what happens in verses 12 through 19. After all, if you think about throughout the Bible, what's the danger of pride? That, numerous verses try to point out about the danger of pride. What is that danger? Yeah, pride goeth before the fall. Pride leads to destruction. Certainly think about James chapter 4 and several passages in the book of Proverbs that offer consistent warnings against pride. And that's what we need to keep in mind as we read verses 12 through 19, that is not provided to us here, but that Hezekiah's heart does have pride within it. And obviously the resolution to what happens here is going to be how his pride is, he's humiliated in his pride for what's going to happen. So again, what happens, verse 12 of chapter 20, 2 Kings 20 and verse 12, you've got the king of Babylon who sends messengers. Baladan, the son of Baladan, sends letters. They send a messenger or send messengers to Hezekiah, under the guise of, celebrating the fact that Hezekiah had recovered from his illness. Some seem to think that because of this relationship, that there is an alliance that develops between Judah and Babylon, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the events of chapter 12, or the events of chapter 20, verses 12 through 19, those events take place around 100 years before the Babylonians would destroy Jerusalem. And that's important to keep in mind because, as we said last week, Babylon is not a major military power like what they would be 100 years later. If we had to put that into comparable terms for us, we would say, for instance, 100 years ago, the United States did not see China as any type of foreign power. In fact, the United States actually, to a degree, kind of allied with China during the Second World War because of Japan's invasion of China and the U.S. fighting Japan, right? 100 years ago, we had no idea that China would become really America's chief rival today. But now we do, even though we helped them out back then. It's a similar idea to what Hezekiah assumes. Assyria is the main threat to Jerusalem, and alliance with Babylon could lead to good things, if that's what's happening here. We do know that there are friendly relations based on Hezekiah welcoming the letters, the present, and these messengers with their gifts into Jerusalem. So, verse 13, Hezekiah was attentive to them, talks about hospitality, shows to them everything that was in the treasury, everything that was in the king's house. There was nothing that Hezekiah hid from these men. Perhaps that was a way of his pride coming out, right, to boast of all the things that Jerusalem had. Much like Nebuchadnezzar later on would boast within himself of all the things that he had built in Babylon. And in both of those instances, we saw God offer his rebuke to the pride of both men. And that's where verse 14 now we come in, where Isaiah steps right back into the picture. And it says that Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say, and from where did they come to you?" So Hezekiah said, "They came from a far country, from Babylon." And he said, "What have they seen in your house?" So Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing among my treasures that I have not shown them." And then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated unto this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the kings in the king of Babylon." So Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good." For he said, "Will there not be peace and truth, at least in my days?" All right, so back up to verse 14. Isaiah, who is obviously inspired by God, recognizes the problem right off the bat. Right? We know from the book of Isaiah, which overlaps with the life of Hezekiah, we know from the book of Isaiah that Isaiah would give numerous prophecies over the course of his life. Some of those prophecies had to dealt directly with Babylon. And so through the divine knowledge given to Isaiah, Isaiah knew that at one point Babylon is going to become Judah's chief enemy. Hezekiah did not see that because he didn't have God's not directly communicating with him and giving him that knowledge, but we know that Isaiah did. And obviously that's the concern that Isaiah would have, that Jeremiah later on would have, is that the people of Jerusalem would try to find a way, or the people of Judah would try to find a way to try to appease what the Babylonians wanted. And so Isaiah understands that, Hezekiah looks at this. Hezekiah's his pride has blinded him from seeing the true nature of this visit and what the actual repercussions of this were. After all, Babylon becomes a mighty military power. They do what military powers did back then. They seek to expand their borders and to acquire more wealth. And they're going to know, based on what Hezekiah has shown, that Jerusalem itself is going to be a nice target, a point of pride for their empire, but also a point of land and wealth that the Babylonians, we know, are going to prioritize later on. Hezekiah, of course, doesn't see this. He tells Isaiah these people are from Babylon, and Isaiah wants to know, what have they seen in your house? And Hezekiah basically says, they've seen everything. Well, Isaiah recognizes that this is not any type of friendly relation. This is not a possibility of an alliance against the Assyrians. Isaiah, because of the knowledge that he has, knows that this is going to motivate the Babylonians to attack and eventually destroy Jerusalem, combined with some things that we'll look at in chapter 21. That's why Isaiah follows up with what's said in verses 16 through 18, that this seemingly innocent thing has severe repercussions for you, at least for the rest of your household. As he said in verse 17, God has said, everything that you have accumulated, right, the things that he took pride in when he was showing those off to the messengers, to the ambassadors from the Babylonians, the things that he took pride in, Isaiah says, all that's going to be taken away from specifically your house. And all that's going to be carried to Babylon. There will not be anything of it left. And we know that after 3 successive waves of the Babylonians coming to besiege Jerusalem, by around 586, 585 BC, we know that the city itself would be just about completely leveled. And after those 3 successive waves, basically all of that would be taken out. Not only that, but he also says that they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now, in the latter half of this section, basically, the last few chapters of 2 Kings, we're going to actually see that take place, where the Babylonians will, either actually physically take away the descendants of Hezekiah into captivity, whether that is to make them essentially prisoners within their own kingdom, because the Babylonians will perhaps allow, as we'll see with the last king, they'll allow the king of Jerusalem to be king, but he's going to be stripped of his power, because he's going to be subjugated to do whatever the Babylonians want. And that's also going to be painful for Hezekiah to have to deal with, right? You not only lose all that you and your fathers have accumulated, going all the way back to essentially David, but even your own offspring is going to suffer eventually from this group of people. Now, in Hezekiah's mind, this might seem preposterous because, again, Babylon's not a threat. Assyria is obviously the threat that comes with the siege of Jerusalem. And in verse 19, Hezekiah, again, the Bible records that Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good." Now, how is it good for Hezekiah? How is it good for the people of Judah? How is it good for his offspring? How is it good that the events of verses 16 through 18 will happen? Why would he say that it is good? If you combine it with verse 19, it could indicate the idea that, Hezekiah at least takes satisfaction in the fact that, well, at least this will not happen under my reign. And certainly I think that's perhaps one way to look at this. I think another way to look at this, though, is that Hezekiah recognizes that this is going to happen. So in other words, when Hezekiah says in verse 19, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good," he's not necessarily talking about that this is a good outcome or these are going to be good results. It may be more the fact that he just recognizes that is, if this is what God has said will happen, then it's going to happen, right? His word is good. It's true in that sense. For he said, will there not be peace and truth, at least in my days? And that could also, indicate too that Hezekiah is thinking about, the preservation of himself. But it also could be the fact that Hezekiah is following up with the question too after that, is this destruction, is this going to happen? Am I going to live to see the destruction of what's presented in verses 16 through 18? And we know, of course, that will not come to pass because we've got 5 more chapters that follow this. So, Hezekiah will not see this, but there is the assurity from the Lord that eventually, 100 years from now, from what we know now, that Babylon would start to undermine Jerusalem and take away its wealth and power. Now, all of this is given because Hezekiah seriously misunderstood the intentions of Babylon. If we think about what's the application for us when we look at this, obviously we're not in a position where we're having to make decisions of a grand scale in terms of, who our country's allied with and whether or not those alliances will give us any long-term benefit. But I think we could think about this maybe on a smaller level. Hezekiah thought to himself that these people from Babylon, he looked at them essentially as his friends, right? They were friendly to him, and Hezekiah treated them as such. And obviously, the Bible puts a premium, the book of Proverbs puts a premium on this. If a man has friends, he must show himself friendly, right? But we have to understand, though, that there are some things that appear friendly to us that we just cannot accept for ourselves. And when we think about how the devil operates, how people fall into sin, sometimes it's because the things that they don't find to be that serious, they don't look at the problem as being a serious problem, but in reality, down the road, it does become a serious problem. Think about what James would say in James chapter 4, in verse 4. Actually, if somebody would read for us James chapter 4, verses 1 through 4.
What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source of your pleasures? Is not the source of your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. And you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship of the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God.
Now, if you think about the context of this book, from my understanding, the book of James apparently was written somewhere around 60 AD, which, if this is the same James that we read about in the book of Acts chapter 15, this is talking about perhaps the situation in which Christians were dealing with in the city of Jerusalem. We know that 10 years after, approximately 10 years after, if James did write this in AD 60, the city of Jerusalem would be destroyed. Perhaps there were a lot of Christians that were in that city that had relatives, even friends perhaps, that were Jewish, that they had friends, relatives that were still adhering to the law of Moses, that were caught up in the whole trying to rebel against Rome, right? And they may have looked at them as friends in that sense. And we know, of course, what happens in AD 70, that attempt to try to overthrow the Roman Empire turns into a disaster for the Jewish population. And perhaps what James is getting at here is this idea of wars and fights. If that's internally, maybe that's externally. And his point is you cannot be friends with the world. In this particular case, perhaps this is for Christians to recognize, this population that's trying to violently overthrow the Roman Empire, you can't be friends with them, because that's going to eventually lead to your own destruction. As he said in verse 4, right, trying to be friends with the world, that is making yourself an enemy to God. So don't get caught up in that, because there perhaps were a lot of Christians who sympathized with the viewpoints that some of those Jews had about the Roman Empire. Because obviously Christians felt the same way, that the Roman Empire itself was very immoral. But James's point and God's point is, right, don't get caught up with being partners with the world. Now, he's not saying that you do not show kindness and friendliness to people in the world, but evidently in what James is getting at here is that you don't become so attached to the world that you cannot pull away from it. And in my mind, that's the problem that Hezekiah had in chapter 20, verses 12 through 19. His friendliness, perhaps seeking a partnership with them, led to the point where, you can't just pull yourself away from it. It obviously shows that you don't trust in God, but it also shows that sometimes those friends that we have in the world do not always have the best intentions for us, especially spiritually. And so, as we think about that, I think the overall point is that we encounter a lot of people in the world that we think about being our friends that have great intentions, but sometimes their intentions may not be what's best for us spiritually. So, for instance, if I've got good friends that tell me that, that are good moral people, but obviously they tell me something like, well, why is going to church so important? Well, they might be good friends to me, and they might be kind to me, but the point is that if I allow that thought to enter into my mind and I accept it, well, I'm going to fall away from God. And that's the concern that God would have with the Babylonians in time. And obviously the problem that God, through Isaiah, is trying to relay to Hezekiah. These people may seem friendly, but they do not have you or the people's best interest at heart, because they're not allied with me. And as a Christian, as I read through that's what I take away from it. Be cautious of those who be cautious of those who we are around, in the sense of don't become so attached that spiritually you start to hurt in the process, because your friends are not, spiritually speaking, what they're supposed to be. And I think this obviously points to the church as well. The fact that, hopefully we all trust each other, right? That we all are friends in that sense, and we can trust one another. But Hezekiah was way too trusting of the Babylonians, is the point. Now, at this point, is there anything that we want to add on before we conclude Hezekiah's life?
The devil works on everybody. He worked on good King David. He worked here on good King Hezekiah. You say working through people, and none of us are immune from the devil working on us either. It's through people, through friends, through associates. I think maybe this is one reason God included this in the Word, to encourage us not to do wrong. But even good people do wrong, and we can be forgiven. I think you look at this and you hear the king could get bad, but thankfully he wasn't a king. So that works on everybody.
Absolutely.
As parents, y'all would tell the kids, be careful who you run with. But that affects the parents also.
Right.
Be careful who we are friendly with. Be friendly to everybody, but our close circle of friends, we need to be careful, because some of them don't want to know all the business.
Right.
It's just because they're not there for your best interest or
Right.
But use it a lot for kids, but it applies to this as well. Be careful who your close inner circle of friends are.
And Adam, one example for us is we have good friends that we travel with, and they're not members of church, so it doesn't matter to them if they get some busy at a Sunday service.
Right.
And so we have to very much that.
Yeah. Right. And no doubt, to the point that y'all were saying too, the messengers that came to view what was there in Hezekiah's house in the temple of the Lord, no doubt when they were going back, they were not saying, how great Hezekiah was, how great God had done for the people of Jerusalem, they're going back and eventually 100 years later thinking about, how are we going to get this for ourselves? Which is, I think, part of the point that all three comments were hitting on. But all three good points. Verse 20 concludes the life of Hezekiah. It says that all of his acts, his might, how he made a pool and a tunnel and brought water into the city. That, of course, being connected in part to the siege of Jerusalem. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Hezekiah rested with his fathers. Then Manasseh, his son, reigned in his place. And if you go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 32, a lot of those details are put in there. You can go into more detail about his wealth. But the point that I wanted to bring out was the pride that Hezekiah had, because that's a key point that's not necessarily identified with 2 Kings chapter 20 in the latter half of that chapter, but it's important to tie in. So Hezekiah is removed from the picture. He's not perfect, but again, the Bible remembers him as a great king. The next king, of course, his son, is not going to be great at all, at least is what's recorded for us in 2 Kings 21. And that, of course, being Manasseh. And we'll start here today and we'll finish the rest of this chapter next week. But in chapter 21, beginning in verse 1, it says that Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. For he built the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He raised up altars for Baal and made a wooden image, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and he worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. And we'll go ahead and stop here, but that line of thoughts continues on in verse 4. But let's note some things that should jump out to us, right? First of all, is Manasseh an older king or a younger king when he's coronated? He's young, right? He's only 12 years old, which perhaps meant that he's got some poor leadership around him. Because again, usually what happens is if you've got a king that young, there's going to be some advisors around him to help him lead until he gets old enough to make all those decisions by himself. That's kind of a common way that a lot of monarchies work. And so he's a young guy. Naturally, I think we compare him to Josiah, who will come later on. And perhaps there are some other comparisons that we'll look at next week. But he's only 12 years old, but he reigns for 55 years in Jerusalem, which meant that he would, based on the math there, it seems that he would die at the age of 66. So he serves for a long time, but again, a long reign as king did not always mean that you would be a good person. And there will be some other things that we note in the life of Manasseh later. But I know that we often think about, the idea that's presented to us in Job, where people suffer a lot of times even though they are good people. The opposite of that is also true. There are a lot of people who succeed in life despite the fact that they are very evil. And Manasseh, as it's recorded for us, he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And notice that the qualification is given that he did evil according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. Now that's going to continue on in the following verses, but let's stop and talk about the significance of that. Remember that when the Israelites went into the land of Canaan, the only way that they would be able to peacefully dwell in that land, as was presented to Moses, as Moses was to present it to the people, and as Joshua was to present it under his leadership, the only way that the Israelites could peacefully dwell in that land was to remove the wickedness from it. It's not because God inherently hated those people. It's simply because God understood that the people of Israel would not do what is right as long as that evil existed in the land. And we know, of course, that the children of Israel were not entirely successful in handling that. As we see in the book of Joshua, There are several of the Canaanites who would eventually still be there. That would cause Israel at times to fall into idolatry. But that was the first thing that they were supposed to do, right? God abhorred the wickedness of those people. He wanted that wickedness to be completely removed from the earth, is the idea. And yet here comes Manasseh to reinstitute it, to reinstitute the same level of wickedness that God had centuries before said cannot coexist with you. But Manasseh wants to bring it back. Verse 3, he doesn't just stop there. It says that he goes and undoes the reforms, or turns back the reforms that his father did, for he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He raised up altars for Baal, and made a wooden image as Ahab king of Israel had done, and he worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. So evidently he did not learn at this point in time from the example of his father, because he brings back Baal worship that had existed since Ahaz, who was the king prior to Hezekiah. He reinstitutes Baal worship. We notice that he himself worships the host of heaven and serve them. Remember that we said that up to Hezekiah, or at least for most of the kings of Judah, that they publicly did not tolerate idolatry. That idolatry did take place, but that the king did not publicly endorse it. This is why he's being compared to Ahab, is because in Israel, Ahab endorsed the worship of Baal. He endorsed idolatry. Much in the same way in the early history of the United States, that certain colonies endorsed a particular religion, right? They gave their approval to it. They gave financial resources to it. Ahab, no doubt, had given financial resources to the worship of Baal and to the worship of idolatry. And yet this is what Manasseh is doing. He's not just tolerating idolatry. He is the reason why it is brought back, and he publicly supports it. Again, the emphasis is on he rebuilt it. He raised up altars. He worshipped all the hosts of heaven. Not that the people did it, as what's recorded for us in in some of the other kings of Judah, but that he is the one that's behind all of this. Verse 4, he also built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. Also he made his son pass through fire, practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft, and consulted spirits and mediums. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. And so all these things show that Manasseh was not going to be like his father, that at this point in time he had no desire to be like his father, and that he did not learn the lesson that Hezekiah did about the danger of pride. As is evident by verse 4, the idea of building altars in the house of the Lord, which is God's dwelling place, showed that as king, Manasseh had no respect for the dwelling place of God. He felt that he had the authority to go in and essentially kick God out of his own house. And as we're going to see next week, God's going to do something about that very seriously. We're out of time. We'll stop this morning. Thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. We'll pick up in this same text again and point out a few other things that should be of note to us. But again, thank you for your time and your attention.